Are you serious? Are you serious? Thank you for being a member of Patreon. Back on January 21st, 1968, I have a now declassified documentation. The United States of America crashed a B-52 bomber that had 4 hydrogen bombs on it. The plane crashed in Greenland, and so the United States, along with the Danish government, immediately went to work on cleaning up the crash site and the decontamination, or at least they had to do some serious monitoring of just how much nuclear radiation fallout would be in that area. The initial element I have of the Defense Atomic Support Agency Nuclear Emergency Team arrived there in Thule Air Force Base with air transportable vehicles and emergency equipment from Sandia Base out of New Mexico. They got there on January 22nd, 1968 to provide radiological and contamination control support for the Crested Ice project. This is what they called the cleanup of this nuclear disaster. They called it Crested Ice. This element of 6 radiological monitors, 2 explosive ordnance disposal technicians, and 1 weapons technical advisor under the NET command. The commander was Captain R.E. McElwee, USN. And he was augmented by 2 instrument repairmen, equipment from Kelly's Air Force Base out of Texas. Shortly after arriving at Thule Air Force Base, the NET positioned their equipment in hangar number 6, made preparations for the following day's activities, including practicing assembly of a prefabricated support shelter for later erection at the accident site. On January 23rd, 1968, the NET members and other disaster control personnel were briefed that the B-52 with 4 hydrogen weapons had crashed approximately 7.5 miles west of Thule Air Force Base and apparently burned through the ice and sank in the North Star Bay. But random beta-gamma checks at the accident site had been conducted by the SAC personnel on January 22nd, and no beta-gamma radiation was detected. But following the briefing, the radiological division was organized with Captain McElwee as the OIC and Major E.B. Dunham as the assistant OIC. NET personnel were assigned to the division, along with a health physicist from the Air Force Directorate of Nuclear Safety from Kirtland Air Force Base, a SAC bioenvironmental engineer, and 11 radiological monitors supplied by the Thule Air Force Base. Action was then taken to set up an instrument repair activity, designate team members for immediate deployment to the accident site, and establish a decontamination facility. On the 23rd of January, an 11-man team of radiological monitors and EOD technicians and AEC advisors proceeded by dog sled to the accident site to locate a suitable support site. They built a helicopter pad. They established a Zero Alpha line, erect a support building with lights and communication equipment, and performed beta-gamma monitoring, searching for weapon components, and make spot checks for low-energy gamma. They were checking for plutonium with a PG-1 probe. The team was relieved by a second team at 1800 hours, and all assigned tasks were completed by 2400 hours, except the Zero Alpha line. The highest beta-gamma readings were 1.5 MR per hour. They were obtained from debris located in the northeast section of the crash site. Random checks with the PAC and the AC-3 probe revealed that alpha radiation in excess of 2 million CPM on debris scattered throughout the burn area. The hotline was then established in Building 773, and procedures had been established earlier to monitor the sleds and the personnel returning from the crash site, with all returning personnel being transported by bus from the pier to the decontamination building. This procedure was continued when helicopters were added for transporting personnel to and from the crash site. Only one bus was ever used between pickup points. That was to limit the decontamination building, and that was to limit the amount of radiation that the vehicle would be contaminated with. Weather prevented any activity at the site on January 24th. It was too bad, 1968. So the radiological division personnel used this period to locate and monitor people in the area, locals who had entered the contaminated area, and to remove them. On January 25th, 1968, flagging of Zero Alpha line was completed around an oval area approximately 3 miles long and 1 mile wide. During this operation, weapons components were discovered, and radiological division personnel were temporarily assigned to search operations the following day. Other early actions consisted of refining the organization of the division and modifying equipment for extreme cold weather use, and generating plans for the grid monitoring and determining requirements for additional personnel and equipment. Plans and operation activities included radiological monitoring of the accident site, monitoring of the Greenlanders who ventured into the contaminated site and area and their lodges, assisting in the establishment of support facilities, and searching for weapons components that were accomplished by the radiological division between January 22nd and January 26th. On January 26, 1968, the division was reconstructed for a more precise functional basis, and plans and operations branch were established with 7 radiological monitors. They were all under the Major E.B. Dunham, and on January 27th, 1968, 40 more additional persons under Colonel K.O. Buckingham arrived and were assigned to the division. 2 Lawrence radiation laboratory consultants, Dr. Tenney and Mr. Benedict, had arrived earlier on the 25th of January and were assigned to assist the plans and operations personnel establishing area radiation levels. Following the completion of the Zero Alpha line around the accident site on the 25th of January, operations personnel temporarily suspended the area monitoring the activity, detecting high levels of radiation. They directed all efforts to assisting in the location and recovery of weapon components. However, planning for later accomplishment of the radiological grid continued, and base support personnel were requested to stake a grid with 100-foot increments over the entire contaminated area. On the 27th of January, an east-west baseline that was 2,700 feet long and north-south line, it was 3,000 feet long from the base, were completely staked. Grid survey work continued. January 29th, and then it was discontinued when a plan evolved for fixing the contaminated snow and the debris by plowing it into the windrows 300 feet apart. Grid stakes would then interfere with this effort. So they started plowing the snow. The snow's contaminated. They know it is. You got locals you got people that are living out there, the locals, that were venturing in to see what was going on, and they're getting contaminated. So the monitoring activity was resumed on the 30th of January. A zero point was established at the southern tip of the burn area, and work started using a radial plot to record the alpha levels along the radials of 30-degree increments extending outward to the maximum of 6,800 feet. Dr. Tenney and Mr. Benedict, Captain McRaney, and Sergeant Bryant, using a Ludium Model 16 Radiac instrument with a field instrument for detection of low-energy radiation, also known as a fiddler. It's a probe, and it's completed the task by January 31st. The following day, a second team of 12 monitors accomplished a resurvey of the radials for data comparison. The data from the two surveys were the same and consequently considered valid. These data were then given to Dr. Wright Langham and Dr. William Carter prior to their departure to Washington, D.C. on February 3rd to bring the results of the radial survey. On the first and second day of February, extension of the 30 degrees of the radiation with the Ludlum instrument and Fiddler probe were accomplished. And so all area monitoring work was then discontinued at that time. And they left. Now, it is believed, they said, with extremely sensitive to the region of gamma radiation associated with the uranium-235 and proved useful in detecting weapon components buried in the snow. But some weapon components were discovered with this equipment. Therefore, daily searches and activities with additional men and equipment continued until the weapon search efforts were finally reduced. So on February 13th, 6 two-man teams were withdrawn from the debris policing and assigned to obtain a second survey of 15-degree increments. This work was completed that day, and on the 14th day of February of 1968, 21 more radiological monitors performed another grid survey using a 50-foot increments. The results are contained in another report. So this report, folks, first of all, no one ever heard really about this. Okay, so you have this B-52 bomber going down in Greenland, supposedly crashing and burning through the snow all the way to the ocean. But pieces and parts of the crash site were found. Radiation levels were extremely high. A lot of men were exposed to it, a lot of military personnel and locals. Basically, after all of the work was done, we kind of just walked off and left it, since it's buried in the snow. But the question is, what were the long-term effects of the radiation from 1968? Now, the one thing the United States did do after this was, on their test runs and missions, they no longer carried the bombs on the plane. Okay? So the planes would be flown on missions, but without the bombs, because they realized the danger of flying around with live bombs hanging on the outside of the planes, unless you're going into a wartime situation. So, I guess the question would be, I wonder how many people got sick from all of this. What's the report of the health? The men were sent to, later on I read further, the men were sent to Wright-Patterson's Air Force Base for a lot of testing on radiation poisoning, a lot of swabs, a lot of tests. The B-52 crew were prepared for sent to the United States Air Force Radiological Health Laboratory at Wright-Patterson's Air Force Base. They were given special overalls to wear that protected them from creating radiation on the others at the Air Force Base. So in other words, it was to hold the to hold the radiation in on them and not to expose the others. They were put in quarantined bio-environmental locations. But I do not know the condition of the men or whatever happened to them. But this is the dangers of war, folks. This was a Patreon report. I'll keep digging out stuff. We'll keep you informed. Think how that was 1968. Think how dangerous things are now. Are you saved? Thank you for being a member of Patreon.